The digital clock on the nightstand cast a harsh red glow across the darkened bedroom. 3:23 a.m. Jack Miller's eyes snapped open, his heart hammering against his ribs as the nightmare's grip slowly loosened. Sweat dampened his t-shirt, the sheets tangled around his legs like restraints. In the fading echoes of the dream, he could still hear his daughter's voice, small and terrified. "Daddy, don't let them take me." The faceless social workers, the judge's gavel coming down with finality, Emily's fingers slipping from his as they pulled her away. Jack swung his legs over the side of the bed, pressing his palms against his eyes until colored spots danced in the darkness. 18 days. That's all the time he had left before the trial. 18 days before a jury would decide whether he was an innocent man or a thief who deserved to lose everything. He moved silently down the narrow hallway of their small apartment, the worn carpet muffling his footsteps. The door to Emily's bedroom was cracked open, just enough to let in a sliver of light from the hallway nightlight. Jack peered through the gap. Emily lay curled on her side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed giraffe she'd had since she was 2, her dark hair spread across the pillow. 7 years old and already carrying burdens no child should have to bear. Jack felt the familiar ache in his chest, a mixture of fierce love and crushing fear. 18 days. He backed away from the door, careful not to wake her. In the kitchen, he filled a glass with tap water, noticing the slow drip from the faucet he'd been meaning to fix. One more thing on an endless list of tasks he couldn't seem to get ahead of. The small Boston apartment told the story of their lives in 1,000 tiny details. Photos of Emily at various ages covered the refrigerator, her smile growing with each year, her front teeth missing in the most recent school picture. A small collection of tools sat in a plastic caddy under the sink, not the professional-grade equipment he once owned, but enough to handle household repairs. The second-hand furniture was mismatched but clean, the throw blanket on the couch carefully folded despite its frayed edges. Everything in its place, a controlled environment in a life that had spun wildly out of control. Jack's eyes drifted to the framed certificate hanging on the wall, partially hidden behind a hanging plant. Miller and Blackwood Landscaping, it proclaimed in flowing script, the business license he and Richard had been so proud of 5 years ago. He should have taken it down months ago, but something had stopped him. A reminder, perhaps, of how quickly trust could be broken, of how thoroughly a life could be dismantled. Morning arrived too quickly, sunlight filtering through the thin curtains as Jack stood at the stove, flipping pancakes shaped like animals. The kitchen faucet had started leaking more aggressively, water pooling in the basin. He grabbed his tools from under the sink, working methodically to tighten the connection while keeping an eye on the pancakes. The rubber washer was worn, but he could make it last another month with the right amount of pressure. His fingers moved with practiced precision, the small repair a welcome distraction from the thoughts that had kept him awake most of the night. Emily appeared in the doorway, her pajamas rumpled, hair sticking up in defiance of gravity. The smell of pancakes hit her nose, her face lighting up as she scrambled onto a stool at the counter. Jack could fix anything. That's what Emily always told her friends at school. Daddy can fix anything except Mommy leaving. The memory of those words, spoken so matter-of-factly when Emily was 5, still had the power to knock the wind from his lungs. Breakfast unfolded with Emily's non-stop chatter filling the small kitchen. She jumped from topic to topic like a hummingbird. Her art project at school, Joey Martin's pet hamster that escaped during show and tell, Ms. Patel's new sparkly glasses, all punctuated with enthusiastic bites of misshapen pancakes. Jack listened, inserting questions and comments at the right moments while his mind raced through the day ahead. The double shift at the warehouse, the meeting with his court-appointed attorney, the rent payment coming due. The kitchen sink dripped one final time before the new seal held tight. Jack wiped his hands on a dish towel, satisfaction momentarily replacing the constant anxiety. Emily watched him work, fascination in her eyes. You know, Daddy, you could be on one of those TV shows where they fix things, except you wouldn't need a whole team. You could do it all yourself. Her faith in him was both balm and burden. If only fixing their lives were as straightforward as repairing a leaky faucet. The drive to Emily's school took them through their blue-collar neighborhood in Boston's outskirts, past corner stores with security gates and apartment buildings with laundry hanging from fire escapes. Jack's ancient Honda protested at each stoplight, the engine coughing before reluctantly continuing. In the passenger seat, Emily had her nose pressed to the window, waving at familiar faces on the street. She belonged here in a way Jack both appreciated and worried about. This neighborhood had become home after they'd been forced to downsize, but it wasn't what he had planned for her. At the school drop-off, Emily gathered her backpack and lunchbox, her movements suddenly hesitant, the morning's energy dimming as she looked at the building. The whispers had started again last week. Dylan Perkins had told everyone in class that Emily's dad was a criminal. Mrs. Klein had put a stop to it, but the damage had been done. Jack watched the transformation in his daughter's demeanor, helplessness washing over him. He leaned across the console, straightening her slightly crooked headband. Just remember what we talked about, Em. Sometimes people say things that aren't true because they don't know better. We know the truth, and that's what matters. Emily nodded, but the shadows remained in her eyes as she climbed out of the car. Jack watched until she disappeared through the school doors, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The memory surfaced unbidden. Richard Blackwood's face across the conference table, features arranged in an expression of righteous indignation as he accused Jack of stealing $65,000 from their company accounts. 5 years of friendship and partnership erased in an instant, replaced by allegations that had seemed to come from nowhere. Richard's lawyer had produced spreadsheets, bank statements, forged emails, a paper trail meticulously crafted to point directly at Jack. The warehouse job had been a lifeline when no one else would hire a man under investigation for embezzlement. Jack pulled into the employee lot, parking between a rusted pickup and a motorcycle held together with more hope than engineering. Inside, the foreman handed him his scanner without making eye contact, the unspoken judgment hanging in the air. 8 hours of lifting, scanning, moving, the mindlessness of the work both blessing and curse. His body could go through the motions while his mind replayed the destruction of his life in high definition. Miller and Blackwood Landscaping had started with 2 second-hand mowers and a shared dream. Jack had always been good with his hands, could coax life from the most neglected gardens, understood the language of growing things. Richard had brought the business acumen, the polished sales pitch, the connections from his country club upbringing. They'd built something real together, a company with 15 employees, contracts with some of the city's most prestigious properties, a reputation for quality work. Jack had believed they were friends as much as partners, had trusted Richard implicitly. The memory of that trust now tasted like ash. The first signs of trouble had been subtle. Richard pushing for expansion when their current operation was already stretched thin. New office space in a trendy district they couldn't really afford. The company credit card statements Jack wasn't allowed to see. Then came the meeting where Richard had laid out the evidence, his face a mask of disappointment as he'd explained to their employees that Jack, their Jack, had been stealing from them all. The shock had been physical, like stepping off a cliff he hadn't seen coming. By the time Jack had recovered enough to defend himself, the narrative had solidified. Richard had friends in the district attorney's office. The investigation moved with surprising speed. The warehouse walls seemed to close in as Jack mechanically scanned boxes, loaded pallets, checked inventory. His attorney, Thomas Rivera, had called that morning. They had a meeting at 4. Thomas hadn't sounded optimistic. The court-appointed lawyer was competent but overwhelmed, his caseload impossible, his resources limited. He'd been honest from the beginning. The evidence looked bad, very bad. Without money for expert witnesses or forensic accountants, their defense options were limited. If Jack was convicted, he'd face up to 5 years. 5 years of Emily growing up without him. 5 years of her in foster care, because her mother had walked out when she was 2, leaving nothing but a note saying she wasn't cut out for this life. The thought sent ice through Jack's veins, his movements becoming mechanical as he fought to push the image away. Not Emily. Not his bright, chattering, drawing-obsessed little girl who put her shoes on the wrong feet and believed her father could fix anything. Not the child who still left a light on for her mother, just in case she decided to come home. The shift ended at 3, giving Jack just enough time to meet with Thomas at the courthouse. He changed in his car, switching his warehouse uniform for the cleanest shirt and least worn jeans he owned. The courthouse loomed, all imposing columns and broad steps, a physical manifestation of a system that felt increasingly stacked against him. Inside, the air conditioning raised goosebumps on his arms as he navigated the marble halls, following the now familiar path to the small conference room where Thomas conducted his meetings. Thomas Rivera looked exactly like what he was, a dedicated public defender drowning in an impossible caseload. His tie was slightly askew, dark circles underlined his eyes, and the coffee in his mug had long gone cold. Case files covered the table, post-it notes protruding from all angles. He greeted Jack with a firm handshake and grim smile, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I've been reviewing everything again, Jack. The prosecution's case is strong. The forged emails, the account transfers. Someone did a very thorough job of making it look like you took that money." Jack's fingers tightened around the armrests. Richard had resources Jack couldn't match. Private attorneys, financial experts, connections throughout the Boston business community. The system wasn't designed for men like Jack, men who worked with their hands and lived paycheck to paycheck, men who couldn't afford to fight back against a lie wrapped in legal jargon and official letterhead. Thomas shuffled papers, his expression softening with genuine concern. "There's something else. I've been asking around about Judge Reed, who's scheduled to hear our case. He has connections to the same country club as Richard Blackwood. Nothing that would force a recusal, but..." The implication hung in the air between them. Another disadvantage, another hurdle. Jack stared at his calloused hands, the dirt permanently embedded under his nails despite scrubbing. A working man's hands versus a businessman's words. A moment of clarity washed over him, cold and absolute. If this was a battle of resources and connections, he'd already lost. But if there was even a sliver of a chance to stay out of prison, to remain in Emily's life, he had to fight with whatever tools he had left. "If there's one thing I want my daughter to learn, it's that this world isn't always fair. But a real man never stops fighting for what's right. I didn't take that money, Thomas. Not a penny of it. And I won't plead guilty to something I didn't do, no matter what deal they offer." Thomas nodded, respect flickering in his tired eyes. "Then we keep fighting. I've submitted a motion to examine the original electronic records, not just the printouts Blackwood provided. If they're falsified, there might be metadata that shows tampering. The judge will rule on it next week." Hope was a dangerous thing, Jack had learned. It could sustain you through impossible circumstances or crush you when it proved false. He allowed himself just a small measure of it as he left the courthouse, the weight on his shoulders incrementally lighter. The drive to Mrs. Helen Garvey's apartment took him through familiar streets as dusk settled over the city. Helen had been Jack's neighbor when Emily was born, had stepped in to help when Ashley had struggled with postpartum depression. When they'd had to move after the accusations, Helen had insisted on remaining Emily's after-school caretaker, refusing to believe the charges against Jack. The apartment building was similar to their own, worn but clean, housing people who worked hard for everything they had. Helen opened the door before Jack could knock, her shrewd eyes taking in his expression immediately. Emily was at the kitchen table surrounded by colored pencils and paper, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Jack's heart constricted at the sight. Every drawing on the table showed the same scene. A man in judge's robes, holding an oversized hammer. The magical judge who would save Daddy. Helen motioned Jack into the tiny kitchen, keeping her voice low. She had trouble at school again today. That Perkins boy. She wouldn't talk about it, just started drawing these as soon as we got home. Jack had complained to the school administration twice already. Dylan Perkins was repeating what he heard at home, where his father, a former client of Miller and Blackwood Landscaping, had decided Jack's guilt was a foregone conclusion. The school had promised to address it, but children were merciless with perceived weakness. Emily's status as the daughter of an accused thief had made her an easy target. The next morning brought cold rain and dark skies, matching Jack's mood as he dropped Emily at school. Her goodbye hug lasted longer than usual, her small arms tight around his neck. Outside the classroom, Jack found himself face to face with Dylan's father, Mark Perkins. The man's lip curled slightly as he recognized Jack, deliberately stepping back as if proximity might be contaminating. Jack felt heat rise in his throat, the accumulated stress of months seeking an outlet. It would be so easy to confront him, to demand he keep his opinions away from his son, to release some of the anger that had been building since Richard's betrayal. Instead, Jack thought of Emily, of what she needed from him: stability, control, an example of how to face adversity with dignity. He nodded curtly and walked away, his hands clenched into fists in his pockets. In the car, he pressed his forehead against the steering wheel, drawing deep breaths until the trembling in his hands subsided. The wipers squeaked across the windshield, struggling to keep pace with the increasing rain as Jack pulled into traffic, heading for his second job at the auto parts store. The shift dragged, customers few and far between in the bad weather. Jack restocked shelves and organized inventory, grateful for the mindless tasks that kept his thoughts from spiraling. His manager, Pete, was one of the few people who had given Jack a chance despite the pending charges. An old-school mechanic with grease permanently embedded in his knuckle wrinkles, Pete valued skill and work ethic over rumors. He'd seen Jack diagnose complex automotive issues that had stumped seasoned mechanics, had witnessed his encyclopedic knowledge of parts and repairs. In Pete's garage, Jack was still worth something. By the time his shift ended at 11, the rain had intensified, sheets of water reducing visibility to mere feet. Jack hunched over the steering wheel, peering through the windshield as his wipers fought a losing battle. The Honda's heater wheezed ineffectually, barely taking the edge off the chill that had settled into his bones. His mind drifted to Emily, hopefully asleep at Helen's apartment, where he would pick her up after his shift. The arraignment was tomorrow. Thomas had called during his lunch break. The judge had denied their motion to examine the electronic records, citing insufficient cause. One more door closing. One more path to the truth blocked. The memory of his mother surfaced unexpectedly, her voice as clear as if she were sitting in the passenger seat. Character isn't about what you do when things are good, Jackie. It's what you do when everything's falling apart. His mother had raised him alone after his father died in a construction accident when Jack was 10. She'd worked 2 jobs, had never missed a school event, had taught him that a man's true worth was measured in integrity and hard work, not dollars and cents. She wouldn't have believed the charges against him for a second. The thought of her unwavering faith brought both comfort and sharper grief at her absence. Cancer had taken her 3 years ago, before Emily's 4th birthday. The hazard lights appeared through the curtain of rain like distant warning beacons, rhythmic flashes of red reflecting off the wet pavement ahead. Jack's foot eased off the accelerator, the car slowing as the shape of a vehicle emerged from the downpour. A luxury sedan, deep burgundy, pulled onto the shoulder of the road. Even through the storm, Jack could recognize the distinctive lines of a car that cost more than he'd make in 5 years. A figure stood beside it, illuminated intermittently by the hazard lights, one hand held over their head in a futile attempt to ward off the rain, the other frantically working a cell phone. Jack's first instinct was to continue driving. It was late, he was exhausted, and whoever owned that car certainly had roadside assistance or friends who could help. People with cars like that had resources, had networks, had options Jack no longer possessed. His hands tightened on the wheel, ready to accelerate past the stranded motorist. Then he noticed something about the figure's posture, the slight hunch of the shoulders, the frustrated gesture as the phone was lowered. Not anger, but something close to despair. His mother's voice again, gentle but insistent. Jack eased the Honda onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking to life as he put the car in park. The rain hit him like a physical blow as he stepped out, instantly soaking through his jacket and t-shirt. He raised one hand as he approached, making sure the person could see him clearly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The figure turned, and even through the rain, Jack could see the wariness in their posture, the slight step backward. He stopped, maintaining a respectful distance, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "Ma'am, you okay? Car trouble?" The woman hesitated, studying him through the downpour. In the intermittent glow of the hazard lights, Jack could make out an elegant face, dark hair plastered to her head by the rain. Clothes that even soaked through screamed quality and expense. She seemed to make a decision, nodding slightly. "It just died. Won't turn over." Her voice carried the practiced calm of someone accustomed to being in control, to having problems solved efficiently. Jack recognized the tone. It was how Richard's friends from the country club spoke, how the clients from the wealthy neighborhoods addressed the landscaping crew. It was the voice of someone who existed in a different world than his, someone whose problems were inconveniences rather than catastrophes. For a moment, the temptation to walk away resurfaced. This woman wasn't his problem. She'd have help soon enough. But the rain was coming down harder, the temperature dropping, and regardless of her wealth or status, she was still a person stranded in a storm. Mind if I take a look? I'm not a mechanic, but I've kept enough old cars running to know a thing or two. Another pause, another assessment. Then, with a slight nod, please, I'd appreciate it. She popped the hood, and Jack stepped forward, the rain pelting his back as he leaned over the engine. The luxury car's components were arranged differently than the vehicles he usually worked on, but the principles remained the same. His fingers traced along wires and connections, methodical despite the cold rain seeping through his clothes. Within minutes, he'd found the issue. Your battery terminal's loose. Probably got jarred by a pothole. You got any tools? The woman shook her head, and Jack jogged back to his Honda, retrieving the battered toolbox he kept in the trunk. As he worked, tightening the connection and cleaning the corrosion with the edge of a rag, he found himself talking, filling the silence the way he did when Emily couldn't sleep. This battery's on its last legs. You should get it replaced soon. There's a garage about 2 miles up on Lexington, that's honest. Ask for Mike. Tell him Jack Miller sent you. He won't overcharge you. He could feel her watching him, her posture gradually relaxing as she realized his intentions were genuine. Even in the rain and darkness, he registered the details of her presence, the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the way she carried herself with quiet authority despite being stranded and soaked. She was the kind of woman who commanded rooms, he could tell, the kind who made decisions that mattered. The connection clicked into place and Jack straightened, wiping rain from his eyes with his forearm. Try it now. She slid into the driver's seat, turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a purr that put his Honda's asthmatic rattle to shame. The relief on her face was immediate, genuine, transforming her features. She reached for her purse. How much do I owe you? Jack shook his head, already backing toward his car. Just glad I could help, ma'am. His clothes were plastered to his skin, water streaming down his face. All he wanted now was to pick up Emily from Helen's and fall into bed for a few hours before facing the arraignment in the morning. But the woman called after him. Wait, at least tell me your name. Jack turned back, rain drumming against his shoulders. For a moment, their eyes met fully, and he saw something there beyond gratitude. A kind of respect, as if she were seeing something in him that most people missed. Jack Miller, he said, because he was too tired to be cautious, because the arraignment was tomorrow, and nothing seemed to matter anymore. Jack Miller. Thank you, Jack Miller. Her voice had warmed despite the cold. You might have saved my evening. Jack climbed back into his Honda, watching her hazard lights disappear in his rearview mirror as he pulled back onto the road. He never asked her name. In the grand scheme of his imploding life, it didn't seem important. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a stark contrast to the previous night's downpour. Jack stood in the small bathroom of their apartment, adjusting the tie Thomas had lent him for the arraignment. The suit jacket was slightly too large, the pants a bit too short, but it was the best option available. In the living room, Emily sat on the sofa beside Helen, both already dressed despite the early hour. Helen had insisted on coming to the courthouse, on being there for moral support, as she put it. Emily had been equally determined, refusing to go to school, her face set with a stubbornness that reminded Jack painfully of her mother. How do I look, Em? Jack turned from the mirror, arms spread wide, attempting lightness he didn't feel. Emily studied him critically, head tilted to one side. You look like a superhero in disguise. Like in the movies when they have to wear regular clothes but they're still super strong underneath. Jack's throat tightened unexpectedly. Helen stood, straightening his tie with practiced movements, her eyes suspiciously bright. You look like a man who tells the truth, Jack Miller. Now let's go show that judge who you really are. The courthouse was busier than during Jack's previous visits, people flowing through the security checkpoints, lawyers in crisp suits conferring with the clients, court officers directing traffic. Jack kept Emily's hand firmly in his, Helen following close behind as they navigated to the assigned courtroom. Thomas was waiting outside, his expression carefully neutral as they approached. He pulled Jack slightly aside, voice low. Remember what we discussed. Answer clearly. Look at the judge, not at Blackwood. This is just an arraignment, not the trial. We enter the plea, and then we start building our defense. The courtroom doors opened, and Jack felt Emily's hand tighten in his. The polished wooden benches, the state flag beside the stars and stripes, the bailiff standing at attention. It all seemed designed to intimidate, to remind everyone present of the power the system held over their lives. Jack spotted Richard immediately, sitting beside his attorney in an expensive suit, his posture relaxed and confident. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Jack saw something flicker in his former friend's expression. Not guilt or remorse, but something closer to satisfaction. Emily tugged at Jack's hand, her voice a whisper that carried in the quiet room. Is that the bad man who told lies about you? Jack squeezed her hand gently, guiding her toward the front benches where Thomas indicated they should sit. That's Mr. Blackwood, yes. Remember what we talked about? In court, we stay calm and respectful, no matter what. Emily nodded solemnly, though the look she directed toward Richard could have withered steel. Thomas arranged his files on the defense table, his movements betraying none of the pessimism he'd expressed in private. Jack sat beside him, hands clasped tightly in his lap to stop their trembling. The reality of the situation pressed down upon him with crushing weight. In a few moments, he would stand before a judge and enter a plea of not guilty to charges that could destroy his life. And based on everything Thomas had told him, the odds were stacked heavily against him. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiff called for attention. All rise for the Honorable Judge Elizabeth Harrington. Jack stood on shaking legs, his eyes fixed on the door through which the judge would enter. The name wasn't familiar, not Judge Reed as Thomas had expected. Perhaps a last-minute substitution. A small spark of hope ignited in Jack's chest. A different judge might mean a fresh perspective, someone without connections to Richard's social circle. The judge entered, black robes flowing, her posture commanding and authoritative as she took her seat behind the bench. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Wait, he knew that face. Those eyes, that way of carrying herself with quiet confidence. His mind flashed back to the rainy night, the woman beside the burgundy car, the gratitude in her expression when he'd fixed her battery terminal. No, it couldn't be. But the more he stared, the more certain he became. The lighting was different now. Harsh fluorescent instead of darkness and rain. She was in formal robes instead of soaked clothes. Her hair was pulled back severely instead of wet and loose around her face. But those eyes, the shape of her face, the set of her mouth, Judge Elizabeth Harrington was the woman he'd helped in the storm. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. Was he imagining this? Maybe his desperate mind was seeing connections that didn't exist, looking for hope in impossible places. But even as he questioned his sanity, he knew he wasn't wrong. The woman whose car he'd fixed last night was now sitting behind that bench, holding a gavel that would influence his fate. He glanced at Thomas, but his attorney was focused on his notes, completely unaware of the storm raging inside Jack's head. Judge Harrington, Elizabeth, was reviewing the case file, her expression neutral and professional. If she recognized him, she gave no sign of it, not a flicker of acknowledgement, not a hint of familiarity. Maybe she didn't remember him. Maybe the rain and darkness had obscured his features enough that she wouldn't connect the mechanic in the storm with the defendant before her. The proceedings began, and Jack tried to focus, tried to listen as the prosecutor outlined the charges against him. Embezzlement, wire fraud, theft. Each word felt like a hammer blow. Thomas responded with practiced efficiency, entering the not guilty plea, requesting discovery of evidence, his voice steady and confident. Jack's mind kept returning to the judge, to the impossible coincidence, to what it might mean for his case. Throughout the hearing, he found himself stealing glances at Judge Harrington, trying to be certain, trying to reconcile the desperate woman in the rain with this stern figure of authority. Every time he looked, he was more convinced, and every time he told himself he had to be wrong. The statistical probability alone was astronomical. Then something happened that made his heart stop. The prosecutor was presenting the financial documents, and Judge Harrington leaned forward, her eyes sharp as she examined them. Mr. Daniels, these are photocopies. Where are the originals? Jack's breath caught. It was her. It had to be her. But she never looked at him, never gave any sign that she recognized him. Her face remained perfectly neutral, perfectly professional, as she questioned the prosecutor about the evidence. I have concerns about these documents. This court will not proceed without proper authentication of the originals. Mr. Rivera, your motion for forensic examination is granted. We will reconvene when we have properly authenticated documents. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and Jack flinched. The courtroom began to clear, but he remained seated, his mind reeling. Thomas was talking beside him, explaining what had just happened, how unusual it was, how this could change everything. But Jack barely heard him. His eyes were on Judge Harrington as she gathered her files and disappeared through a door behind the bench. Was it her? Had the woman he'd helped in the rain just potentially saved him right back? Or was his desperate mind playing tricks on him, creating hope where there was none? He wanted to believe. He wanted so badly to believe, but he couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty would haunt him. Elizabeth Harrington leaned against her chamber's door, her hands trembling as she pressed them flat against the wood. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning with the magnitude of what had just happened. Jack Miller, the man who'd stopped in the pouring rain to help her, the man who'd refused payment and smiled wearily before disappearing into the night. She'd recognized him instantly when he stood in her courtroom, had watched the same recognition dawn in his eyes, followed by confusion and uncertainty. She'd maintained her professional composure through sheer force of will, had given no indication that she knew him. To acknowledge it, to show any sign of recognition, would be grounds for immediate recusal. And if she recused herself now, this case would go to Judge Reed, who she knew for a fact had played golf with Richard Blackwood at the Brookline Country Club just last month. Elizabeth pressed her fingers to her temples, the ethical implications of her position crashing over her like waves. She'd just bent every rule in the book. She'd leveraged her position to demand evidence examination that should have been standard procedure. She'd gone against precedent in this courthouse, where white-collar cases involving less than $100,000 were typically fast-tracked through the system. But what choice did she have? Let an innocent man go to prison because the system was too overloaded to do its job properly? The evidence she'd reviewed was flimsy at best, the kind that would never stand up to proper scrutiny. Jack Miller was being railroaded, and the only person who could stop it was someone who should have recused herself the moment she saw his name. Elizabeth had built her career on following the rules, on being above reproach, on embodying the blind justice the system aspired to represent. At 38, she was the youngest judge in the district court's history, having sacrificed personal relationships and family plans on the altar of professional advancement. Her colleagues respected her. The legal community admired her. She'd never compromised her ethics, had never allowed personal feelings to influence her judicial decisions. Until today. Until she looked into the eyes of the man who had helped her without hesitation, without expectation of reward, when he had every reason in the world to drive past a stranded stranger. Her car had died in the worst possible location, a stretch of road with poor cell service in the middle of a rainstorm when she was already running late for an important dinner. Roadside assistance had estimated an hour wait. She'd been considering calling a rideshare when Jack had appeared like some working-class guardian angel, his tools held together with duct tape, his hands competent and sure as he diagnosed and fixed the problem in minutes. The Jack Miller who stood in her courtroom today was the same man. Tired eyes that still managed to be kind, shoulders bearing invisible weight, hands that could fix broken things. Elizabeth had seen thousands of defendants in her career, had developed an instinct for character that rarely led her astray. Jack Miller was not a thief. The charges against him were paper-thin, the kind that should never have made it past preliminary hearings. And Richard Blackwood, she'd seen his type too many times before. The polished exterior, the practiced sincerity, the subtle condescension toward the court-appointed defense attorney. A man accustomed to systems working in his favor, to problems being solved with money and connections rather than merit, the kind of man who believed rules existed for others. Elizabeth moved to her desk, sinking into the leather chair as ethical principles warred with human instinct. She'd granted the motion for forensic examination. a completely reasonable judicial decision based on the questionable quality of the evidence. No one could fault her for that. But she knew her motivations weren't entirely pure, knew that the face of the defendant had influenced her scrutiny of the prosecutor's case. Sometimes justice required impossible choices. She just hoped she was making the right one. The forensic accounting order would take time to fulfill, 2 weeks at minimum, given the backlog at the district's digital forensics lab. 2 weeks of uncertainty, of questioning her decision, of wondering whether she'd compromised everything she believed in for a man she'd met for 10 minutes in a rainstorm. 2 weeks felt like 2 years. Jack went through the motions, working at the warehouse and auto parts store, picking up Emily from school, reading bedtime stories, pretending everything was fine. But every night he lay awake wondering, was it her? Had she recognized him? Was that why she demanded the forensic examination? Or was he imagining connections that didn't exist, seeing miracles where there was only coincidence? Emily sensed his preoccupation, his mind constantly elsewhere even when they were together. "Daddy, you're thinking too loud. It's keeping me awake." Her small voice cut through the darkness of her bedroom where Jack sat on the edge of her bed, long after finishing the second chapter of Charlotte's Web. "Sorry, baby girl, go back to sleep. Is it about the court thing?" "Yeah. Mrs. Helen says judges are fair, says they help good people." "I hope so, Em. I really hope so." Emily's faith in the system was both touching and terrifying. Jack had tried to protect her from the worst of his fears, but children were perceptive. She'd started drawing obsessively, pictures of courtrooms, of judges with giant hammers, of bad men being led away in handcuffs, while stick figure representations of Jack and Emily held hands in victory. Her teacher had called, concerned about the fixation. Jack had explained as best he could, grateful when Ms. Patel had offered extra support rather than judgment. The wait for the forensic report stretched Jack's nerves to breaking point. Thomas called with updates that weren't really updates. The lab was working on it. These things take time. Be patient. Richard seemed equally on edge, calling an emergency meeting with his investors to reassure them, according to industry gossip that reached Jack through former colleagues. The company was struggling without Jack's expertise, clients complaining about declining service quality. It should have brought satisfaction, but Jack felt only hollow grief for the business they'd built together, now faltering under the weight of Richard's betrayal. Work became Jack's sanctuary, the mindless physical labor at the warehouse and the focused problem-solving at the auto parts store, providing temporary respite from his churning thoughts. Pete had been giving him more hours, more responsibility, recognizing Jack's mechanical aptitude and customer service skills. It wasn't the career he'd planned, wasn't the future he'd envisioned when he and Richard had signed the business license for Miller and Blackwood Landscaping, but it was honest work that paid the bills. For now, that had to be enough. On the Tuesday of the second week, Thomas called while Jack was restocking spark plugs, his voice vibrating with contained excitement. "Jack, the report, it's in. It's everything we needed. Gregory fabricated everything. The digital records prove it. You're going to be okay." Jack's legs gave out. He sat down hard on a stack of oil filter boxes, phone pressed to his ear, tears stinging his eyes. The relief was so intense it manifested as physical pain, pressure building in his chest until he could barely breathe. "We're going back to court tomorrow. Judge Harrington wants to reconvene immediately." The name sent a fresh jolt through him. Judge Harrington. Elizabeth, the woman from the rainstorm. Had she really been his salvation? Or was it just the system finally working as it should? The next day, Jack stood in the same courtroom, wearing the same borrowed suit, but everything else had changed. Thomas practically vibrated with confidence beside him, the forensic report clutched in his hands like a talisman. Richard sat at the prosecution table, his usual smugness replaced by a tightly controlled panic. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently in his ear as Judge Harrington entered the courtroom. After careful examination of the evidence, Judge Harrington said from the bench, her voice carrying absolute authority, "This court finds that the prosecution's case is built on fraudulent documents. The digital banking records conclusively demonstrate that Richard Blackwood, not Jack Miller, committed the embezzlement in question. Mr. Miller, all charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. The courtroom erupted in noise, but Jack heard none of it. Nah. His hands were shaking, his vision blurring with tears he couldn't control. Free? He was free. The nightmare was over. Emily would not lose her father. Helen was crying openly in the gallery, one arm wrapped tightly around Emily, who was bouncing in her seat with uncontained joy. Furthermore, Judge Harrington continued, her voice cutting through the chaos. I'm referring this case to the district attorney with a strong recommendation that charges be filed immediately against Richard Blackwood for fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and obstruction of justice. The gavel came down with finality. Jack looked up at her, really looked at her, and their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. In that moment, he knew it was her. It had always been her. She'd known who he was from the moment his case crossed her desk, and she'd fought for him anyway. But before he could say anything, before he could even process what he wanted to say, she was standing, gathering her files, disappearing into her chambers with the same professional efficiency she'd shown throughout the proceedings. Thomas was embracing him, talking about civil suits and compensation. But Jack barely heard him. His eyes were on that closed door. He wanted to thank her, needed to thank her. But how could he? How could he approach a judge who had just exonerated him and ask if she was the woman whose car he'd fixed in the rain? It seemed impossible, inappropriate, potentially dangerous for her career. So he left the courthouse that day with freedom in his hands and questions in his heart. But he knew, deep down he knew, and somehow, someday, he had to find a way to say thank you. Richard was led away in handcuffs, his face ashen, his eyes finding Jack's in a silent plea that came far too late. Jack felt no satisfaction at the sight, only a profound weariness. This had never been about revenge or justice. It had been about survival, about staying in Emily's life, about clearing his name. As the courtroom emptied, Emily broke free from Helen's grasp and launched herself into Jack's arms. "We won, Daddy. The magic hammer worked." Jack held his daughter close, her absolute faith in fairness and happy endings both humbling and terrifying. "Yes, Em, I guess it did." The following weeks passed in a daze of readjustment. Jack found himself suddenly free of the cloud that had hung over him for months. Former clients called, asking if he would consider working for them again. Former employees reached out to apologize for believing Richard's lies. The local paper ran a small article about the case. Local businessman cleared, former partner charged. A public vindication that helped ease some of the social stigma Emily had faced at school. Jack declined most of the landscape work offers, choosing instead to stay at the auto parts store where Pete had promoted him to assistant manager. The hours were more regular, the stress lower, and the environment free from the painful associations of his former business. Emily thrived with the return of stability to their lives, her nightmares subsiding, her drawings shifting from courtroom scenes to more typical 7-year-old fare. Unicorns, rainbows, and elaborate princess castles. But through it all, Jack couldn't stop thinking about Judge Harrington. He'd scoured local newspapers for information about her, learning that she came from a wealthy Boston family, had graduated from Harvard Law with honors, had been appointed to the bench at 35 after a distinguished career as a prosecutor. Elizabeth Harrington moved through a world entirely different from his own. Charity galas, symphony fundraisers, political connections. Yet something about her had seemed genuinely human that night in the rain. Frustrated, vulnerable, grateful for help from a stranger. 6 weeks after the dismissal of charges, Jack was restocking shelves in aisle 7 of the auto parts store, battery supplies, which felt appropriate given how this whole thing started, when a voice behind him said, "Excuse me, do you know where I might find battery terminals?" Jack turned, and there she was. Not in judge's robes this time, not behind a bench with a gavel in her hand, just a woman in jeans and a casual sweater, her hair down, standing in the auto parts store with a slight smile on her face. "It's you," he breathed, the package of windshield wipers slipping from his hands. "I knew it in the courtroom. I thought, I wasn't sure, but I knew." Her smile widened, warmer now, more genuine. "You recognize me too. How could I not? Your face, your voice, but I kept thinking, maybe I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks because I was desperate." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You knew too, the whole time. You knew I was the guy who fixed your car. From the moment I saw your photo in the case file, the coffee mug I was holding hit the floor and shattered. But you couldn't say anything. If I'd acknowledged it, I would have had to recuse myself. Your case would have gone to Judge Reed. Jack closed his eyes, understanding washing over him. And Judge Reed would have convicted me. He has a 94% conviction rate and no patience for public defenders. So you risked everything. His voice was barely a whisper. Your career, your reputation. I could lose my position if anyone found out, Elizabeth said quietly. I broke about a dozen ethical guidelines, but I'd do it again in a heartbeat. They stood in the middle of the auto parts store, surrounded by mundane things, spark plugs and oil filters and windshield wiper fluid, and the moment felt sacred. Why? Jack asked, the question that had been haunting him for weeks finally finding voice. Why would you risk so much for someone you met once in the rain? Elizabeth's eyes met his, direct and unflinching. Because that one meeting told me everything I needed to know about your character. A man who stops in the pouring rain to help a stranger, using tools held together with duct tape, refusing payment when he clearly needs it. That's not someone who steals from others. That's someone with integrity. And I couldn't watch an innocent man go to prison just because the system was too lazy to look at the real evidence. Jack felt tears sting his eyes. Months of tension finally finding release. You saved my life, saved my daughter from losing her father. Elizabeth's expression softened. You helped me first. You had every reason to keep driving that night. You were exhausted, worried, probably running through worst-case scenarios about your trial, but you stopped anyway. You showed me something I'd stopped believing existed. Real, uncomplicated human goodness. I never even learned your full name that night. I know. I realized that later. You gave me yours, Jack Miller. But you never asked mine, and I never offered it. If I had, would things have been different? I don't know, maybe. But maybe everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. There's something else, Elizabeth said, a smile playing at her lips. During your hearing, you brought your daughter to court once. She had to wait in the hallway during the proceedings. Jack nodded. Emily, Mrs. Garvey, Helen, was sick that day, and I had no one else to watch her. She drew me a picture, gave it to the bailiff to give to me. Elizabeth's smile widened, a judge with a superhero cape. She told him I had a magic hammer that made bad people go away. Despite everything, the weight of the conversation, the emotion churning in his chest, Jack laughed. It burst out of him, genuine and surprised. She thinks your gavel is magic. She's been telling everyone at school about the nice lady with the magic hammer who saved her daddy. I'd love to see more of her drawings. Then, with visible courage, with vulnerability showing through her professional composure, maybe over coffee? If that's allowed, now that the case is closed. Jack felt his heart ease something complicated in his chest, something that felt like hope and gratitude in the beginning of something neither of them had expected. It's allowed, he said, his voice thick with emotion. In fact, I'd really like that. I'd really like that a lot. The forensic accounting team worked in a windowless room in the basement of the Boston courthouse, their computers humming through the night as they untangled the digital web Richard had woven. Lead investigator Maureen Chen had seen thousands of financial fraud cases in her 15 years with the district attorney's office, but something about the Miller case bothered her from the start. The evidence was too neat, too perfectly aligned, like someone had reverse engineered the crime scene rather than committing an actual crime. She'd requested original server logs, timestamp metadata, and digital signature verification, tools that could reveal manipulation invisible to the naked eye. Jack lived in suspended animation during those 2 weeks, mechanically moving through his shifts at the auto parts store, forcing smiles for Emily, pretending that the constant knot in his stomach wasn't tightening with each passing day. The temporary relief of Elizabeth's, Judge Harrington's intervention had faded, replaced by a pragmatic understanding that even with the forensic examination, the system could still fail him. He'd seen enough in the past months to know that justice wasn't guaranteed, that truth didn't always prevail. The district attorney's tech team worked through terabytes of data, restoring deleted files, analyzing access logs, and reconstructing the digital trail. The breakthrough came on day 9 when analyst Devin Park discovered anomalies in the document properties, microscopic evidence of tampering that Richard hadn't been sophisticated enough to hide. Timestamp inconsistencies or showed files supposedly created by Jack had actually been accessed and modified by Richard's computer during hours when security footage confirmed Jack wasn't even in the building. The digital fingerprints were unmistakable to trained eyes. At home, Emily sensed the fragility beneath Jack's reassurances. Her drawings became more elaborate, more insistent. A series depicting a caped judge with an enormous golden hammer defeating a businessman with dollar signs for eyes. Her teachers called with concerns about her fixation, but Jack recognized the drawings for what they were: Emily's way of controlling a narrative that threatened her security. On the wall above her bed, she'd taped her most detailed creation, a courtroom scene where the hammer-wielding judge pointed accusingly at a man labeled liar, while Jack and Emily stood triumphant to one side. "I made it special, Daddy, so we can remember when we win." Elizabeth found herself checking the forensic team's progress daily, careful to frame her inquiries as routine administrative follow-up. Each night she reviewed her decision to remain on the case, questioning whether her personal interest had compromised her professional judgment. She'd built her career on meticulous adherence to judicial ethics, yet her first encounter with Jack had awakened something that transcended legal boundaries, a recognition that sometimes justice required human insight beyond procedural formality. Her colleagues had noticed her distraction during staff meetings, her law clerk questioning whether she was feeling well when she declined her usual afternoon tea. The forensic report arrived on Thomas Rivera's desk with a decisive thud. The public defender sat motionless for several minutes, scanning the document with increasing disbelief. After months of fighting against overwhelming odds, after preparing Jack for the strong possibility of conviction, he now held irrefutable evidence of his client's innocence. The manipulation was so extensive, so deliberate, that it constituted a separate crime more serious than the original embezzlement. Thomas reached for his phone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed Jack's number. Jack was restocking spark plugs when his phone vibrated against his hip. Pete nodded toward the back room, recognizing the tension that immediately claimed Jack's features. The warehouse's concrete walls and metal shelving made the small space feel like a confessional booth as Thomas's voice came through the speaker, uncharacteristically animated. "The forensic team found everything, Jack. Richard's digital fingerprints are all over the forged documents. The timestamps don't match. The login records contradict his story. The money transfers originated from his home computer, not yours. It's over. Judge Harrington has scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning." Jack gripped the metal shelving to steady himself as the room seemed to tilt beneath his feet, the weight of months of fear and uncertainty suddenly lifting. The courtroom felt different this time, the same polished wood and solemn atmosphere, but without the crushing dread that had accompanied Jack's previous visits. Emily sat beside Helen in the front row, practically vibrating with excitement in her yellow dress, chosen specifically for the occasion because yellow was the color of happiness and magic hammers. Jack's borrowed suit felt less like a costume and more like armor as he took his place beside Thomas, whose posture radiated a confidence previously absent. Richard Blackwood entered flanked by 2 attorneys, his usually immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of strain, a loosened tie, hair slightly disheveled, the confident smile replaced by tight-lipped apprehension. The prosecuting attorney shuffled papers nervously, already distancing himself from a case that was about to implode. The bailiff's call to rise triggered a collective intake of breath as Judge Harrington entered, her black robes settling around her like a declaration of authority. Jack searched her face for any hint of recognition, any acknowledgement of their shared secret, but her expression remained professionally neutral as she took her seat and called the court to order. The proceedings moved with unexpected efficiency. The forensic report was entered into evidence, its damning conclusions summarized with clinical precision. Thomas spoke briefly, his normally hesitant delivery replaced by quiet certainty. The prosecutor offered no meaningful resistance, conceding that the evidence no longer supported the charges against Jack Miller. Then Judge Harrington's gavel came down, her voice clear and measured as she dismissed all charges with prejudice, effectively closing the door on any possibility of retrial. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for immediate investigation into charges of forgery, perjury, evidence tampering, and malicious prosecution against Richard Blackwood. Bailiff, please take Mr. Blackwood into custody pending arraignment on these charges. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Richard was led away in handcuffs, his face ashen with shock. Emily's squeal of triumph cut through the noise as she launched herself over the gallery railing and into Jack's arms, her small body colliding with his chest in a tangle of yellow fabric and unrestrained joy. Jack held his daughter tightly, burying his face in her hair to hide the tears that threatened to overwhelm him. When he finally looked up, his eyes sought Judge Harrington's across the now chaotic courtroom. For a single electric moment, their gazes locked, and Jack saw something flicker behind her professional mask. A brief, unguarded acknowledgement that passed between them like a current. Then she was gathering her files and striding toward her chambers, the black robes billowing behind her as the door closed with finality. Thomas clapped Jack's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. Justice isn't just about the final verdict, Jack. It's about the journey to get there. Every step, every setback, every person who refuses to let the truth stay buried. The public defender's words crystallized something Jack had been struggling to articulate, that beyond the relief of exoneration lay a more complex emotion, gratitude for those who had believed in him when evidence and circumstance argued otherwise. The following days brought a whirlwind of adjustments. News of Richard's arrest and Jack's exoneration spread through their professional circle, prompting a parade of apologetic calls from former colleagues and clients. The local paper ran a small but significant article. Local businessman cleared of embezzlement charges, which Emily proudly taped to the refrigerator next to her hammer-wielding judge drawings. Jack's phone rang constantly with job offers from landscape companies eager to capitalize on the publicity or genuinely remorseful for having believed the worst. Jack declined them all, choosing instead to remain at Westridge Hardware, where Pete had promoted him to assistant manager. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years building a landscaping business only to find more satisfaction in the straightforward honesty of the hardware store, helping people solve tangible problems with concrete solutions. There was something cleansing about this simpler life, something that aligned with his reassessment of what truly mattered in the wake of nearly losing everything. The case's resolution brought practical challenges alongside the emotional relief. Jack's credit had been decimated by the legal ordeal, making it difficult to secure a better apartment despite his improved financial situation. Some parents at Emily's school still regarded him with lingering suspicion, the stigma of accusation more persistent than the vindication of innocence. Emily herself struggled to reconcile the past month's uncertainty with their sudden resolution, her nightmares persisting despite the happy ending she'd so confidently predicted in her artwork. 2 months after the dismissal, Jack was organizing the automotive section of the store when a familiar voice behind him asked about battery terminals. The world seemed to pause as he turned to find Elizabeth Harrington standing in aisle 7, dressed in jeans and a simple blue sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders rather than pulled into the severe style she wore on the bench. The fluorescent lights revealed details the courtroom's distance had obscured. The flecks of gold in her brown eyes, the single freckle at the corner of her mouth, the subtle tension in her posture that belied her casual appearance. I hoped you'd be working today. The Boston Globe said you'd taken a position here after declining to return to landscaping. Elizabeth's voice carried none of the judicial authority he remembered from court, instead holding a hesitant warmth that matched her slight smile. Jack fumbled with the package in his hands, suddenly acutely aware of the contrast between them. Her tailored casual wear against his employee polo, her manicured nails against his work-roughened hands, her cultivated diction against his straightforward speech. Their conversation unfolded awkwardly at first, both hyper-aware of the unusual circumstances of their connection. Elizabeth explained how she'd recognized him instantly in her courtroom, how ethical guidelines had prevented her from acknowledging their prior meeting, how she'd pushed for the forensic examination within the boundaries of judicial discretion. Jack listened, still processing the reality that the woman who had effectively saved his future was now standing in his workplace, seemingly seeking his company. I broke about a dozen ethical guidelines. Elizabeth's voice dropped to ensure their privacy among the shelves of automotive supplies. But I'd do it again tomorrow. In a world where most people only do what's easy, you chose to do what was right when it was hardest. That's a kind of character you can't fake. The sincerity in her words disarmed him, breaking through the wall of caution he'd built against hoping for anything beyond survival. For months, Jack had focused exclusively on clearing his name and protecting Emily, deliberately suppressing any thought beyond the next day's challenges. Now, standing in the fluorescent-lit aisle with a woman whose world should never have intersected with his, he felt something unexpected stir. The possibility that life might offer more than just a return to normalcy. I have a break in 15 minutes. The words escaped before he could reconsider. There's a coffee shop next door, if you'd like to talk somewhere more comfortable than between motor oil and antifreeze. Elizabeth's smile widened, revealing a small gap between her front teeth that humanized her perfection. I'd like that very much. The coffee shop was a far cry from the upscale establishments Elizabeth normally frequented. Mismatched furniture, chipped mugs, and a barista with more tattoos than exposed skin. Yet she settled into the worn armchair across from Jack with apparent ease, wrapping her hands around her mug as if drawing warmth from more than just the coffee. The initial awkwardness gradually dissolved as they ventured beyond the case that had connected them, discovering unexpected points of intersection between their disparate lives. Elizabeth described growing up in Boston's affluent Beacon Hill neighborhood, daughter of a federal judge and a corporate attorney, her path to Harvard Law and eventual judgeship seemingly predetermined. The pressure to be exceptional was constant, the family name both privilege and burden. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a role, wearing a costume everyone else designed. Elizabeth's confession carried the weight of something rarely voiced aloud. The black robe gives me authority, but it also separates me from the real world, from people whose lives are actually affected by my decisions. Jack recognized the loneliness beneath her words, a different flavor of the isolation he'd experienced as a single father navigating a system designed for two-parent households. He found himself sharing stories of raising Emily, the panic of her first fever, the improvised Halloween costumes, the parent-teacher conferences attended alone, the bedtime questions about her mother that tied his stomach in knots. Elizabeth listened with an attention that felt like a physical presence, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite curiosity. Their conversation extended well beyond Jack's break, Pete waving away his apologetic glance through the coffee shop window with a knowing smile. The easy exchange surprised them both. Despite their dramatically different backgrounds, they shared a fundamental seriousness about their responsibilities and a quiet determination that had shaped their respective paths. By the time they reluctantly parted, something had shifted between them, the courtroom hierarchy replaced by tentative friendship. Elizabeth's car gleamed in the hardware store parking lot, another stark reminder of the gulf between their worlds. Jack walked her to the driver's door, suddenly unsure how to end their impromptu meeting. "I'd like to see you again, if that's something you'd be interested in." Her directness caught him off guard, accustomed as he was to being the initiator in social situations. "Yes, I'd like that." His simple response seemed inadequate against the complexity of what they were potentially beginning. Yet Elizabeth's smile suggested it was exactly right. Their coffee meetings became a regular occurrence over the following weeks, carefully scheduled around Jack's shifts and Emily's school hours. Elizabeth gradually revealed more of herself, her passion for classical music, her collection of first-edition mystery novels, her secret preference for action movies over the art house films her colleagues discussed. Jack shared his knowledge of native plants, his ability to predict weather changes from sky patterns, his talent for fixing practically anything mechanical. The differences in their education and income became less prominent as their conversations deepened, revealing complementary rather than conflicting perspectives. Jack initially kept these meetings separate from his home life, uncertain how to integrate this unexpected connection into his relationship with Emily. The decision dissolved 3 weeks later when his babysitter canceled last minute, forcing him to bring Emily to what would have been his fourth coffee date with Elizabeth. He arrived at the cafe with apologies ready, only to find Elizabeth delighted by the development. Emily recognized her immediately despite the casual clothes and loose hair. "You're the magic hammer lady." The exclamation drew amused glances from nearby tables as Emily climbed into the chair beside Elizabeth, already pulling a folded drawing from her backpack. I made this for you. It's you stopping the bad man from taking Daddy away. The crayon illustration depicted Elizabeth in flowing black robes and a cape, wielding a hammer that emitted lightning bolts, with Jack and Emily standing beneath a rainbow, while a stick figure with dollar signs for eyes cowered in the corner. Elizabeth accepted the artwork with genuine appreciation, asking questions that treated Emily's creative choices with serious consideration. Why did you make the hammer gold instead of brown? Because gold is special and your hammer is special. And why is there a cat watching from the tree? Because every good story needs a cat. Within minutes, Emily had commandeered the conversation, recounting school adventures and explaining her complex theory about why dinosaurs would make excellent judges if they hadn't gone extinct. Jack watched in amazement as Elizabeth engaged with his daughter's rapid-fire commentary, matching Emily's enthusiasm without the condescension adults often adopted with children. She asked follow-up questions that showed she was truly listening, laughed genuinely at Emily's jokes, and treated her opinions with respect. By the time they'd finished their drinks, Emily had extracted a promise that Elizabeth would come to dinner sometime to see her complete collection of judge drawings and to meet her stuffed giraffe, who was also studying to become a judge. As they walked Emily back to the car, Elizabeth's hand brushed against Jack's, a momentary contact that sent an unexpected current through him. It had been so long since he'd considered himself as anything other than Emily's father that the reminder of his identity as a man capable of attraction and connection caught him off guard. The complexity of their situation reasserted itself. She was a judge, a Harvard graduate, a member of Boston society. He was a hardware store manager with a community college degree and a history of public legal troubles. The gap seemed unbridgeable when viewed objectively. Jack's concerns found validation that evening in Helen's reaction to news of their coffee meetings. The elderly woman had been Jack's most steadfast supporter throughout his ordeal, but her expression clouded as he described Elizabeth's connection to their lives. People like that don't really cross over, Jack. Not permanently. They might visit, might even convince themselves they belong for a while, but eventually they go back to their own kind. I don't want to see you and Emily hurt when she remembers which world she belongs in. Helen's warning echoed Jack's own doubts, yet something in him resisted the easy cynicism. He'd seen something in Elizabeth that transcended her polished exterior, a genuine searching quality, an awareness of the limitations of her privileged perspective, a hunger for connection beyond the superficial relationships her position encouraged. Still, Helen's concern planted seeds that germinated in the quiet hours after Emily's bedtime, when pragmatism reasserted itself against hope. Elizabeth faced parallel skepticism from her professional circle when she mentioned having coffee with the defendant from the Blackwood case to her colleague and mentor, Judge Margaret Wilson. The older woman's eyebrows had risen nearly to her hairline, her response measured but pointed. The appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as impropriety itself, Elizabeth. I understand your compassion, but maintaining appropriate boundaries protects both him and you. The judiciary functions on public trust. Margaret's caution was reasonable, rooted in decades of navigating the complex ethical landscape of their profession. Yet Elizabeth found herself increasingly frustrated by the arbitrary boundaries that separated her from experiences outside her privileged bubble. Her entire life had been a careful progression of appropriate choices, the right schools, the right career path, the right social connections. Jack Miller represented something different, an unplanned connection based on genuine human recognition rather than strategic advantage. Their dinner at Jack's apartment marked a crossing of invisible lines. Elizabeth arrived bearing a bottle of wine that cost more than Jack's monthly cable bill and a children's book for Emily about a girl who becomes a judge. The small apartment, which had always felt adequate to Jack, suddenly appeared through Elizabeth's presumed perspective. The mismatched furniture, the water stain on the ceiling, the cramped kitchen with its outdated appliances. Yet Elizabeth moved through the space with apparent ease, complimenting the photographs on the walls and admiring Emily's art display without a hint of condescension. Emily appointed herself tour guide, leading Elizabeth through each room with proprietorial pride, explaining important features like the window that stuck in humid weather and the closet door that made spooky noises at night. Look, this is Daddy's toolbox. He can fix anything with it. Even cars in the rain. Emily's innocent reference to their first meeting brought a shared smile between the adults, a private acknowledgement of the unlikely chain of events that had brought them to this moment. Dinner itself was simple. Jack had prepared his specialty pasta dish, the sauce simmering all day to develop its flavors. Emily dominated the conversation, peppering Elizabeth with questions about judges and courts and whether she could put bad guys in jail forever and ever. Elizabeth answered with patience and appropriate simplicity, occasionally glancing at Jack with amusement as Emily's interrogation intensified. When Emily finally excused herself to prepare her stuffed animal courtroom for Elizabeth's later inspection, the adults found themselves alone for the first time that evening. "You're remarkable with her." Jack's observation carried more weight than casual compliment, acknowledging the genuine connection Elizabeth had established with his daughter. Many adults either talked down to Emily or became overwhelmed by her intensity, but Elizabeth had matched her energy without losing authenticity. "I had younger siblings, 5 of them actually." Elizabeth's revelation surprised him. She'd never mentioned siblings in their previous conversations. Being the oldest means you learn to take children seriously while still being the adult. "I miss that honesty sometimes. In court, everyone performs. Lawyers, witnesses, even other judges. Nothing is straightforward." The evening progressed with unexpected comfort, the conversation flowing naturally as they cleared dishes and prepared Emily's bedtime snack. Jack found himself relaxing, the consciousness of their differences receding as they discovered shared perspectives on responsibility, integrity, and the complex balance of idealism and pragmatism. When Emily finally surrendered to sleep after extracting 3 bedtime stories from Elizabeth, they settled on the small balcony overlooking the neighborhood, the night air cool against their skin. Elizabeth's world gradually came into sharper focus as she described the pressures of her position, the isolation of decision-making, the weight of consequences, the constant scrutiny from both legal colleagues and the public. "The black robe is like armor, but it's heavy. Every decision affects real lives, real futures. Make one mistake, and someone pays for it. Someone like you almost did." Her vulnerability opened something in Jack, allowing him to share his own fears of failing Emily, of never recovering professionally from the shadow of accusation, of the future's uncertainties. Their conversation extended into the night, neither eager to end the unexpected intimacy of shared confidences. When Elizabeth finally rose to leave, the air between them had changed, charged with possibilities neither had anticipated when she first appeared in his hardware store aisle. Jack walked her to her car, hyper-aware of her presence beside him, of the subtle scent of her perfume, of the way streetlights caught in her hair. At her car door, Elizabeth turned to face him, her expression serious beneath the gentleness. "I'd like to see you again, but I need you to understand that my world is complicated. There are professional considerations, appearances to maintain. People will have opinions about this, whatever this is becoming." Her honesty was refreshing, addressing directly the challenges they both recognized. Jack appreciated the absence of false reassurance or premature promises. "I understand complicated. I've got plenty of my own." His response drew a smile from her, acknowledgement of their shared realism. "But I'd still like to see you again, too." Their relationship developed gradually over the following month, carefully navigated around their respective responsibilities. They discovered shared interests in hiking the conservation areas outside Boston, in documentaries about historical mysteries, in hole-in-the-wall restaurants with authenticity prioritized over ambiance. Elizabeth proved surprisingly knowledgeable about car mechanics, the result of a teenage rebellion phase where she'd learned engine repair to defy her father's expectations of feminine interests. Jack revealed an unexpected passion for classical literature, borrowed from the library during the long hours when Emily's mother was hospitalized for postpartum depression. They established a comfortable rhythm, seeing each other once or twice a week, building understanding through consistent presence rather than grand gestures. Emily became an enthusiastic participant in their developing connection, delighted by Elizabeth's willingness to engage in elaborate, imaginary scenarios and serious discussions of 7-year-old priorities. Helen remained skeptical, but gradually softened as she witnessed Elizabeth's genuine investment in both Jack and Emily's well-being. 6 weeks into their tentative relationship, Elizabeth invited Jack to attend a charity fundraiser for the city's Legal Aid Foundation. The invitation represented a significant shift, their first public appearance in Elizabeth's professional sphere rather than the neutral territory they'd previously occupied. Jack accepted with a mixture of determination and apprehension, aware of the scrutiny they would face but unwilling to hide, as if their connection were something shameful. The event was held at the Boston Harbor Hotel, its ballroom transformed with elegant decorations and subtle lighting. Jack felt the difference immediately upon entering, not just in the obvious wealth displayed in the women's jewelry and men's custom suits, but in the atmosphere of casual entitlement, the assumption of belonging that permeated the crowd's movements. Elizabeth had prepared him with names and backgrounds of key attendees, but the information felt inadequate against the reality of Boston's legal elite in their natural environment. Jack moved through the room beside Elizabeth, acutely conscious of his rented tuxedo and unfamiliarity with the social codes that everyone else seemed to navigate instinctively. Elizabeth introduced him simply as Jack Miller, offering no explanation for his presence, meeting the curious glances with calm directness. Some of her colleagues were warmly welcoming, others coolly polite, all visibly assessing the unexpected pairing. Jack found himself repeatedly explaining that yes, he managed a hardware store, and no, he hadn't attended law school, the conversations growing increasingly uncomfortable as the evening progressed. During a momentary separation from Elizabeth, Jack overheard a conversation between two attorneys near the bar, their voices carrying just enough for him to catch fragments. Elizabeth's charity project, and slumming it, and phase she's going through. The casual dismissal stung more than outright hostility would have, reducing his entire existence to a temporary diversion for a bored judge. Before he could decide how to respond, another voice entered the conversation, deeper, male, painfully familiar. Jack turned to find Richard Blackwood standing feet away, a drink in hand, dressed impeccably despite the pending charges against him. Richard's presence at the event was jarring, a stark reminder that in certain circles, criminal charges were merely inconveniences rather than catastrophes. Released on bail pending trial, he apparently retained enough social capital to secure an invitation to an elite gathering. Their eyes met across the small space, Richard's momentary shock quickly replaced by calculated assessment. Jack felt a surge of anger so intense it manifested physically. Tightened jaw, accelerated heartbeat, hands instinctively forming fists at his sides. The man who had nearly destroyed his life now stood casually sipping champagne in a room full of people who should, by profession if not conviction, care about justice. Elizabeth materialized beside Jack, her hand finding his arm in a gesture both supportive and cautionary. Her expression remained composed, but Jack felt the tension in her fingers, the subtle pressure directing him away from confrontation. Richard observed their interaction with narrowed eyes, his gaze calculating as it moved between them, clearly reassessing the nature of their connection. Later, Jack would recognize this moment as the catalyst for what followed, the point where their developing relationship transformed from personal choice to public statement. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of performative civility, Jack maintaining outward calm while inwardly seething at Richard's presence in the overheard conversation. When they finally escaped to the hotel's waterfront terrace, the night air cool against flushed skin, Jack allowed his frustration to surface. "I don't belong here, Elizabeth. These aren't my people." The words emerged more harshly than intended, carrying the accumulated tension of the evening. Elizabeth's response was equally direct, her eyes reflecting the harbor lights. "They're not really my people either. That's why I invited you, because all of this feels empty without something real to anchor it." Her honesty punctured his defensive anger, replacing it with a more complicated understanding. Elizabeth existed between worlds, privileged by birth and education, yet increasingly disconnected from the values that undergirded her social circle. Jack represented something her professional peers couldn't offer: authenticity untempered by ambition, connection based on mutual recognition rather than strategic advantage. "I may not fit into your world, but at least I know where I belong." That's a kind of truth money can't buy. The acknowledgement of their differences emerged not as barrier, but as recognition of complementary strengths, each possessing what the other lacked. The evening concluded with a new equilibrium between them, the public scrutiny having accelerated rather than damaged their developing connection. As they walked to the valet stand, Richard appeared again, his timing too precise to be coincidental. His smile contained no warmth as he addressed Elizabeth with forced casualness. "Judge Harrington, what a surprise to see you with Mr. Miller. I wasn't aware you two were acquainted outside the courtroom." The implication hung in the air between them, an insinuation of impropriety, a veiled threat of potential scandal. Elizabeth met his gaze with judicial coolness, her voice carrying the authority of the bench despite her evening attire. "Mr. Blackwood, given the pending charges against you, I suggest focusing on your defense rather than others' personal lives. Any attempt to create false narratives about my professional conduct would reflect poorly on your already compromised credibility." The perfectly calibrated response, neither confirming nor denying any relationship, while clearly establishing boundaries, demonstrated why Elizabeth had risen so quickly through the judicial ranks. As Richard walked away, Jack recognized something beyond his immediate anger, a dawning awareness that their relationship now existed in a public context that introduced new vulnerabilities. Elizabeth's reputation, her carefully constructed professional identity, could become collateral damage in Richard's desperation to escape consequences. The realization added weight to Helen's earlier warnings and Judge Wilson's cautions, not because their concerns about class differences were valid, but because external forces might exploit those differences for malicious purposes. The drive back to Jack's apartment unfolded in contemplative silence, both processing the evening's implications. When Elizabeth pulled up outside his building, the moment expanded with unspoken questions about their path forward. The cautious progression of their relationship had been comfortable, allowing each to maintain necessary boundaries while exploring their connection. Richard's appearance had disrupted that careful balance, forcing acknowledgement of the broader context in which their personal choices existed. "You know he'll try to use this against you." Jack's concern pierced the silence, naming the threat that hung between them. Elizabeth's response carried the weight of consideration rather than impulsive reassurance. "Probably. Does that change anything for you?" The question contained multitudes, about risk and worth, about commitment and consequences, about the value they placed on what was developing between them. Jack looked at the woman beside him, brilliant and accomplished, yet seeking something beyond achievement, powerful in her professional sphere, yet vulnerable in her human needs. The unlikely circumstances of their meeting now seemed less coincidental than necessary, each recognizing in the other qualities they themselves lacked. "No, it doesn't change anything for me." "Does it for you?" Elizabeth's smile in the dim light carried certainty rather than doubt. "Not in the ways that matter." The morning headlines in the Boston Legal Journal hit Elizabeth's desk with her morning coffee. "Judge Harrington's personal connection to former defendant raises ethical questions." The article, accompanied by a grainy photo of Elizabeth and Jack leaving the charity event together, detailed their developing relationship and insinuated impropriety in her handling of his case. The journalist had done his research, connecting Elizabeth's last-minute assignment to Jack's arraignment with the subsequent forensic examination order that had exonerated him. The piece stopped short of direct accusations, but raised pointed questions about judicial conduct and potential conflicts of interest. Elizabeth stared at the paper, her coffee cooling untouched. She'd expected scrutiny after their public appearance together, but the speed and angle of the attack suggested orchestration rather than journalistic initiative. Richard Blackwood's fingerprints were all over this, his desperation to avoid conviction for his own crimes manifesting as character assassination. The professional damage had already begun. Her morning calendar showed 2 recusal requests from attorneys citing the article as evidence of potential bias. Her clerk had delivered them with careful neutrality that failed to mask her concern. Across town, Jack received the news via text message from Thomas Rivera, who had been contacted for comment. Jack's stomach dropped as he read the article on his phone, standing frozen in the middle of the hardware store's paint section. The implications were clear. Elizabeth's career was under threat because of their relationship. The accusations weren't entirely baseless, which made them more dangerous. She had known him before the trial. She hadn't recused herself immediately. She had pushed for the forensic examination that others had denied. The facts, stripped of context and ethical nuance, painted a picture of judicial favoritism at best, corruption at worst. The logical conclusion formed with icy clarity in Jack's mind. He needed to step away, to remove himself from Elizabeth's life before the damage to her career became irreparable. The thought created a physical ache beneath his sternum, but the path forward seemed clear. Elizabeth had spent decades building her reputation, her position on the bench representing not just personal achievement, but the culmination of principles she genuinely believed in. Jack couldn't be the reason that crumbled, couldn't ask her to sacrifice a lifetime's work for a relationship barely months old. Emily sensed his distraction that evening, her chatter about school events meeting uncharacteristic silence. When she finally demanded to know what was wrong, Jack struggled to explain the situation in terms a 7-year-old could understand. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices to protect people they care about. Elizabeth's job is very important, and being friends with us right now might make it hard for her to be a good judge. Emily's response cut through his careful explanation with childlike directness. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard. If she makes you happy and you make her happy, why would you stop being friends? Grown-ups make everything so complicated. Jack's resolve wavered under his daughter's simple logic, but strengthened again when he received a call from Judge Margaret Wilson, Elizabeth's mentor. The older judge spoke with measured precision, each word carefully chosen. Elizabeth is facing a preliminary ethics inquiry based on complaints filed this morning. I'm calling as her friend, not in any official capacity. She values your relationship, Mr. Miller, but you should understand the professional stakes. Judges are held to standards that often sacrifice personal considerations for institutional integrity. The unspoken suggestion hung in the air. If Jack truly cared for Elizabeth, he would remove himself from the equation. The decision crystallized during a sleepless night. Jack drafted and redrafted a message to Elizabeth, struggling to find words that would end their relationship without minimizing what had developed between them. In the end, he opted for directness. I've seen the articles. I can't be the reason your career suffers. You've worked too hard to get where you are. Emily and I will be fine. Thank you for everything. He sent it at 4:38 a.m., then turned off his phone, unable to face her immediate response. Elizabeth received the message as she prepared for court, the notification appearing between emails from her clerk about the day's docket. She read it twice, her composed exterior betraying nothing while her mind processed the implications. Jack was pulling away, making a unilateral decision based on his perception of what was best for her. The gesture contained both care and presumption, protection that assumed she couldn't or shouldn't make her own choices about what risks were worth taking. The realization crystallized something Elizabeth had been feeling since their first coffee date. Jack saw her as a complete person, not just the role she inhabited, but still underestimated her resilience outside the courtroom. The ethics inquiry dominated Elizabeth's thoughts through a day of routine hearings. The preliminary investigation would examine her handling of Jack's case, particularly her decision not to recuse herself immediately upon recognizing him. The evidence against her was circumstantial but compelling, the timing of their public relationship suggesting a connection that predated the courtroom. Only Elizabeth and Jack knew the full truth, and even that truth contained ethical gray areas she had navigated based on instinct rather than procedural guidelines. 3 unanswered calls to Jack's phone confirmed his retreat. Elizabeth left her chambers that evening with uncharacteristic determination, driving directly to his apartment without warning. Helen answered the door, surprise evident in her raised eyebrows. Jack's not here. He's working late. Emily's at her friend Sophia's for a sleepover. The older woman's expression softened slightly as she took in Elizabeth's rigid posture and the shadows beneath her eyes. He's trying to protect you, you know. Thinks he's doing the noble thing. That's not his decision to make. Elizabeth's response carried the same authoritative tone she used in her courtroom, brooking no argument. The ethics charges were filed by Richard Blackwood's attorney. It's a transparent attempt to create leverage for his own case by discrediting me and, by extension, my ruling in Jack's favor. I've faced worse challenges. Helen studied her for a long moment, assessment giving way to reluctant approval. He's at the store until closing. 9 o'clock, inventory night. The hardware store was nearly empty when Elizabeth arrived. most customers having completed their purchases before the dinner hour. She found Jack in the back aisle, methodically scanning power tools with a handheld inventory device. His movements mechanical, his expression distant. He looked up at her approach, resignation mixing with unwilling joy at her presence. His attempt at casual greeting collapsed under the intensity of her gaze. "I got your message." Elizabeth's voice was controlled, but her eyes betrayed the hurt beneath her composure. "You don't get to decide what risks I'm willing to take, Jack. You don't get to walk away because you think it's what's best for me without even discussing it." Her directness caught him off guard, accustomed as he was to people who retreated from conflict rather than confronting it head-on. The judicial demeanor that had once intimidated him now commanded his full attention, making retreat impossible. "Have you seen the articles, the ethics inquiry?" Jack gestured with the inventory scanner, frustration breaking through his careful facade. "They're questioning your integrity because of me. Everything you've worked for is at risk because we happened to meet in the rain before my trial. I'm not worth that kind of sacrifice." Elizabeth moved closer, the distance between them shrinking both physically and emotionally as her professional mask slipped to reveal the woman beneath. "That's my calculation to make, not yours. I've spent my entire life making the safe choice, the appropriate choice, the choice that maintained appearances and met expectations. For once, I'm choosing something because it matters to me, not because it looks good on paper or advances my career." The vulnerability in her admission disarmed Jack's resistance. He'd been prepared for rational arguments, for acknowledgement that ending their relationship was the sensible path forward. Instead, Elizabeth offered something he hadn't anticipated: recognition that their connection transcended conventional cost-benefit analysis. "I can't ask you to risk everything you've built." His protest sounded hollow even to his own ears, the words automatic rather than heartfelt. "You're not asking. I'm choosing." Elizabeth closed the remaining distance between them, her hand finding his in a gesture both assertive and tender. "I've presided over hundreds of cases, heard thousands of testimonies. I know when something is true, Jack, when it's real. What's happening between us, it's worth fighting for. Unless you don't feel the same way." Her final words contained a question, a moment of uncertainty that pierced through her confident exterior. Jack's response wasn't verbal. The inventory scanner clattered to the floor as he pulled her into an embrace that answered more eloquently than words, his arms encircling her with certainty that belied his earlier hesitation. They stood together in the deserted aisle surrounded by tools and hardware, the mundane setting somehow perfect for their reconciliation. Practical, unpretentious, grounded in reality rather than fantasy. Pete's exaggerated throat clearing from the end of the aisle eventually broke their absorption. "Much as I support whatever this is, we've got inventory to finish, and I'm guessing the judge has important legal stuff to prepare for." His matter-of-fact acceptance of their relationship, devoid of judgment or curiosity, reflected the practical attitude that had made the hardware store Jack's sanctuary during his darkest days. Elizabeth stepped back, composure returning though her eyes remained soft. "I'll see you tomorrow?" Jack nodded, the earlier weight lifting from his shoulders. Tomorrow. The following weeks brought intensified scrutiny as the Judicial Conduct Committee expanded its preliminary inquiry into a formal investigation. Elizabeth was permitted to continue hearing cases, but recused herself from any matters involving the district attorney's office, including Richard Blackwood's prosecution, which had been assigned to Judge Patterson as she'd originally feared. The investigation required extensive documentation, statements from court personnel, and detailed timeline verification of her interactions with Jack before and during his trial. Jack faced his own form of scrutiny. Richard's legal team subpoenaed him for a deposition regarding his relationship with Elizabeth, clearly fishing for evidence of impropriety that could undermine his own prosecution. Thomas Rivera represented Jack pro bono during the deposition, objecting vigorously to questions that ventured beyond relevant legal boundaries into personal territory. The experience left Jack drained but more determined than ever to stand beside Elizabeth through the challenge. They weren't just fighting for their relationship now, but against Richard's attempt to weaponize it for his own benefit. Despite the professional pressure, or perhaps because of it, their personal connection deepened. Elizabeth began spending more evenings at Jack and Emily's apartment, gradually integrating into their established routines, helping with homework, participating in movie nights, occasionally staying late enough that Emily simply assumed she would be there for breakfast. Jack discovered Elizabeth's surprising domestic talents. She made exceptional French toast and knew how to fold fitted sheets into perfect rectangles, skills she attributed to caring for younger siblings when her high-achieving parents were occupied with professional obligations. Emily thrived with Elizabeth's presence, absorbing her measured approach to problems and incorporating legal terminology into her playground disputes. She's guilty of stealing my jump rope during recess. I have 3 witnesses and fingerprint evidence. Her teacher called Jack with equal parts amusement and concern, wondering about the sudden interest in courtroom procedure. Elizabeth helped Emily channel this fascination productively, organizing a mock trial for her stuffed animals complete with proper objections and closing arguments. The interactions between them evolved from Elizabeth being Daddy's friend to something more fundamental, though all 3 carefully avoided labeling the transformation. The ethics hearing arrived with formal gravity, scheduled in the federal courthouse rather than Elizabeth's regular workplace. Jack sat in the gallery, watching Elizabeth enter in professional attire that served as armor against the scrutiny she faced. The 5-member panel of senior judges would determine whether her failure to immediately recuse herself upon recognizing Jack constituted an ethical violation warranting disciplinary action. Elizabeth had prepared meticulously with her attorney, organizing documentation of her handling of the case and the timeline of their subsequent relationship. Richard Blackwood's involvement in the complaint became evident during the proceedings. His attorney appeared as a concerned party, presenting a theory that Elizabeth and Jack had a pre-existing relationship before the trial, insinuating that her judicial decisions were influenced by personal bias rather than legal merit. The accusation hung in the air, technically unproven but damaging in its mere suggestion. Jack felt the curious glances from others in the gallery, the weight of suspicion directed toward a relationship that had developed innocently after the case's conclusion. Elizabeth testified with composed precision, acknowledging her recognition of Jack during the arraignment while systematically documenting the legal basis for each judicial decision thereafter. The forensic examination order that had exonerated Jack hadn't been exceptional, but rather standard procedure inexplicably denied by previous judges. Her voice remained steady as she outlined the ethical considerations that had guided her actions, careful to separate her professional conduct during the trial from the personal connection that developed afterward. The committee seemed particularly interested in the night they met, the rainstorm, the disabled vehicle, Jack's assistance with her car. Elizabeth recounted the interaction with careful neutrality, emphasizing its brevity and the limited information exchanged. We spoke for perhaps 10 minutes. He told me his first name only. I didn't provide my name at all. When I saw him in my courtroom the next morning, I recognized him immediately and considered recusal. However, after reviewing the evidence presented, I had serious concerns about procedural oversights in the case that demanded judicial attention, regardless of who presided. Jack's testimony followed, his nervousness evident in his posture, though his voice remained clear. The committee questioned him extensively about their first meeting, probing for inconsistencies or suggestions of a deeper connection than both had claimed. Jack's straightforward answers, devoid of legal maneuvering or strategic calculation, carried an authenticity that even the skeptical committee members seemed to recognize. I fixed her car battery terminal and left. I didn't know she was a judge until I saw her on the bench the next day. I didn't expect any special treatment, and I didn't receive any. What I received was a fair hearing that previous judges hadn't provided. The turning point came unexpectedly through Helen's testimony. The elderly woman had been subpoenaed by Elizabeth's attorney, her decades of community involvement and reputation for blunt honesty, making her an ideal character witness. Helen described Jack's consistent integrity through the false accusations, his devotion to Emily despite overwhelming challenges, and his initial reluctance to pursue a relationship with Elizabeth precisely because of concerns about appearances. Her most impactful statement came in response to questioning about when Jack and Elizabeth began dating. That young woman didn't start seeing Jack until weeks after his case was dismissed. And truth be told, I advised against it. Told him people from her world don't mix with people from ours. But I was wrong about her. She sees Jack, really sees him. when most people in her position wouldn't even notice someone like him exists. The final witness proved most devastating to Richard's insinuations. Judge Margaret Wilson, initially skeptical of Elizabeth's relationship with Jack, testified to her colleague's unwavering ethical conduct throughout her career. Margaret described Elizabeth's case management as exemplary, her decision to order forensic examination as judicially sound given the evidentiary issues, and the timeline of events as consistent with their testimonies. When Richard's attorney attempted to suggest improper influence, Margaret's response cut through the insinuation with authoritative clarity. Judge Harrington has always demonstrated exceptional judgment. The only questionable conduct in this matter is the attempt to weaponize a personal relationship to distract from Mr. Blackwood's own criminal charges. While the panel deliberated, Jack and Elizabeth waited in separate rooms, protocol preventing their communication until the decision was announced. Elizabeth maintained her judicial composure, reviewing documents with her attorney while internally balancing hope against pragmatic preparation for potential censure. Jack paced the small conference room assigned to him, alternating between confidence in Elizabeth's integrity and fear that the system might prioritize appearance over substance, a fear his own experience had unfortunately validated. The committee's decision, delivered 3 hours later, vindicated Elizabeth on all substantive charges. They found no evidence of judicial misconduct or inappropriate influence in her handling of Jack's case. However, they issued a minor procedural admonishment for her failure to document her recognition of Jack in the court record at the time of arraignment, a technical requirement that wouldn't impact her judicial standing but would remain in her professional file. The recommendation emphasized that while no actual impropriety occurred, even the appearance of potential conflicts required meticulous documentation to maintain public trust in judicial proceedings. Elizabeth accepted the decision with professional grace, acknowledging the procedural oversight while expressing satisfaction that the substantive investigation confirmed her ethical conduct. The weight of potential career destruction lifted from her shoulders, replaced by the lighter but still significant challenge of rebuilding any damaged professional relationships. As she gathered her materials, Margaret approached with uncharacteristic warmth. "You walked a fine line perfectly, Elizabeth. Your legal reasoning was impeccable, your ethics sound. But perhaps next time you meet someone in the rain, get their full name." Jack waited outside the hearing room, uncertainty giving way to relief when Elizabeth emerged with a subtle smile that conveyed the outcome before she could share it verbally. They maintained professional distance until reaching the privacy of the parking garage, where the formal separation finally dissolved. Elizabeth practically collapsed against him, the composure she'd maintained throughout the proceedings giving way to emotional release. "They couldn't touch my decisions, couldn't find any impropriety because there wasn't any. I received a procedural admonishment for not documenting our prior meeting, but that's essentially a footnote." The victory felt bittersweet, vindication accompanied by the knowledge that their relationship had been unnecessarily scrutinized, their integrity questioned for Richard's strategic benefit. Jack's response contained equal parts relief and lingering anger at the process they'd endured. "So we went through all of this because Richard wanted to create doubt about your judgment? He put your career at risk just to improve his defense?" Elizabeth's expression shifted, something closer to satisfaction than anger appearing in her eyes. Actually, his strategy backfired completely. The investigation generated additional scrutiny of his case, including evidence handling. The prosecutor found irregularities they might have missed otherwise. His trial has been expedited. Sometimes justice takes unexpected paths, but it usually arrives where it needs to be. The resolution of the ethics investigation removed the immediate threat to their relationship, but left subtler challenges in its wake. Elizabeth's colleagues maintained professional courtesy, but watched her more closely, some questioning her judgment, not for remaining on Jack's case, but for pursuing a relationship that invited scrutiny. Jack sensed her occasional discomfort when they appeared together in public, the weight of being constantly evaluated taking its toll on moments that should have been simply enjoyed. They persevered through this period of adjustment, finding strength in the privacy of family dinners with Emily, weekend hikes away from curious eyes, and the growing certainty that what they'd found together was worth the temporary discomfort. Richard Blackwood's trial proceeded with methodical efficiency under Judge Patterson's no-nonsense supervision. The forensic evidence originally collected for Jack's case proved devastating to Richard's defense, revealing not just the embezzlement, but a pattern of financial manipulation extending back years. Jack testified as a witness for the prosecution, facing his former partner across the courtroom with steady composure that reflected how far he'd come from the desperate man who had once feared losing everything. Richard's attempts to deflect blame crumbled under cross-examination, his carefully constructed facade of respectability disintegrating as the evidence mounted. The guilty verdict surprised no one, but the sentence, 5 years in federal prison plus restitution of all stolen funds, exceeded expectations. Judge Patterson cited the deliberate attempt to frame an innocent man as particularly egregious, meriting punishment beyond standard guidelines for financial crimes. Jack felt no satisfaction watching Richard being led away in handcuffs, only a profound weariness and desire to finally close this chapter of his life. Elizabeth, observing from the public gallery rather than the bench, squeezed his hand as they exited the courthouse. It's over, really over this time. Life settled into new patterns as the media attention faded and private challenges replaced public scrutiny. Elizabeth's position on the bench remained secure, but carried additional pressure to be above reproach in all her decisions. Jack received an unexpected opportunity when Pete announced his retirement, offering Jack the chance to purchase the hardware store through owner financing, an arrangement that acknowledged Jack's limited credit while providing Pete a steady retirement income. The prospect of business ownership, this time solely on his own terms, represented both exciting opportunity and daunting responsibility. Their relationship deepened through these ordinary challenges, each bringing different strengths to shared problems. Elizabeth navigated the financing paperwork for the store purchase, her legal expertise cutting through jargon that might have intimidated Jack. He renovated her aging bathroom when plumbing issues emerged, saving thousands in contractor fees while implementing improvements she hadn't known were possible. Emily thrived with the expanded support system, her academic performance improving as Elizabeth helped with homework, and Jack had more flexible hours as the new store owner. 6 months after the ethics hearing, Jack found himself in Westridge Park with Emily, watching Elizabeth approaching across the grass for their planned Saturday picnic. The spring sunshine illuminated her figure as she walked, more relaxed in jeans and a light sweater than he'd ever seen her in the courtroom. The small velvet box in his pocket seemed simultaneously too heavy and too insubstantial for the magnitude of what it represented. A future together, officially acknowledged rather than carefully navigated. Emily knew about his plans, of course. Keeping secrets from his daughter had proven impossible, particularly something as significant as proposing to the woman who had become an essential part of their lives. Emily had appointed herself proposal coordinator, insisting on selecting the perfect picnic spot beneath the park's largest oak tree and arranging the blanket with meticulous attention to aesthetics. She vibrated with barely contained excitement beside him, periodically adjusting the flowers she tucked behind her ear for fancy occasions. Jack had planned the moment carefully, a private picnic followed by a walk to the park's rose garden where he would propose while Emily waited nearby, allowing them an intimate moment while keeping her involved in the experience. The preparation had felt necessary, a way to ensure the moment matched the significance of asking Elizabeth to formally join their family. But watching her approach, Jack realized the perfect moment already existed in her smile as she spotted them, in Emily's barely contained excitement, in the simple rightness of the three of them together on an ordinary Saturday. Emily ruined his carefully orchestrated plans in the most perfect way possible. Unable to contain her excitement as Elizabeth reached their picnic spot, she blurted out the secret with characteristic volume. "Are you going to ask her to marry us yet? Daddy has the ring in his pocket, and it's burning a hole, just like Mrs. Helen said it would." Elizabeth froze mid-greeting, her expression cycling rapidly through surprise, understanding, and unmistakable joy. Jack felt his carefully rehearsed speech evaporating, replaced by the sudden certainty that no planned words could improve upon this perfectly imperfect moment. "Emily, you were supposed to wait until after lunch, during our walk to the roses." Jack's mock severity collapsed immediately under his daughter's completely unrepentant grin. "Well, I tried, Daddy, but surprises are hard to keep. They're like trying not to laugh when someone says underwear in class. You just can't. Several nearby picnickers had turned at Emily's announcement, some smiling at the unfolding scene, others openly watching with unabashed interest. Jack felt a moment of self-consciousness, aware they had become inadvertent entertainment for strangers. Then Elizabeth laughed, a full, unrestrained sound rarely heard from the typically composed judge, and everything else faded into irrelevance. The audience, the ruined plans, the imperfect timing all receded against the simple truth reflected in her eyes. Jack knelt on the picnic blanket, pulling the small velvet box from his pocket with hands that trembled slightly, despite his certainty. Elizabeth Ross, you changed our lives in more ways than I can count. You saw me when I was invisible. You believed in me when evidence suggested you shouldn't. You looked past appearances to find what matters. He glanced briefly at Emily, who had positioned herself directly beside him, nodding encouragingly at each sentence. You've made us a family already, in all the ways that count. Will you make it official? Will you marry us? Say yes, say yes. I already picked out my flower girl dress, and it's yellow. Emily's helpful addition drew laughter from their impromptu audience, but Elizabeth's attention remained fixed on Jack, tears streaming freely down her face despite her wide smile. Yes, yes to both of you, all of you, forever and ever. Emily launched herself at Elizabeth with characteristic enthusiasm, nearly knocking her over with the force of her hug. I knew it. I told Daddy you'd say yes. Mrs. Helen owes me $5. You bet on this? Jack asked, incredulous, as he slipped the ring onto Elizabeth's finger. Well, yeah, I had insider information. I'm very smart about these things. I'm basically a professional matchmaker. The small crowd that had gathered applauded spontaneously, several people wiping away tears of their own. One elderly woman called out, "Best proposal I've ever seen, thank you." I helped plan it, Emily responded immediately, waving as if accepting applause at a performance. Jack pulled Elizabeth close, kissing her while Emily made exaggerated gagging sounds before immediately pivoting to practical matters. Okay, now that that's over, can we get ice cream? This is definitely an ice cream moment. The wedding was planned for the following spring, a date that allowed adequate time for arrangements while reflecting their mutual desire to formalize their relationship without unnecessary delay. Emily took her dual role as flower girl and wedding coordinator with characteristic seriousness, creating elaborate lists and insisting on multiple dress rehearsals in the living room. We need to practice, Daddy. What if I forget how to throw petals? What if I throw them too hard and they hit someone in the face? That would be bad for the photos. Elizabeth approached wedding planning with the same methodical efficiency she applied to complex legal cases, creating spreadsheets and timelines that left nothing to chance. Yet beneath the organization lay genuine excitement that occasionally broke through her composed exterior, gasping over the perfect venue, tearing up unexpectedly during the cake tasting, laughing uncontrollably when Emily insisted on practicing her flower petal throwing technique during dinner. Jack observed these moments with quiet joy, appreciating this new dimension of the woman he'd first encountered in a rainstorm. The wedding day arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind that feels symbolic rather than coincidental. The garden venue bloomed with subtle decorations that enhanced rather than competed with the natural beauty. Soft flowers hanging from tree branches, simple white chairs arranged in rows, sunlight filtering through leaves to create nature's own spotlight. Helen, who had become like a grandmother to Emily and an unexpected friend to Elizabeth, wept openly throughout the ceremony. Thomas Rivera served as best man, his toast acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances of their meeting. I've seen many versions of justice in my career, but watching these two find each other, that's something beyond what any courtroom could deliver. That's the universe making things right. Janet, Elizabeth's clerk from the courthouse, served as maid of honor and spent half the ceremony dabbing at happy tears. Emily, now 8.5, the half is very important, people, stood as flower girl in her insisted upon yellow dress. She'd practiced her walk down the aisle countless times, but when the moment came, she skipped instead of walking, explaining later to anyone who would listen. Skipping is more joyful. This is a joyful day. Everyone should skip more. It's scientifically proven to make you happier. I read it somewhere, too, during the ceremony when the officiant asked if anyone objected to the union, Emily stage whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. If anyone says anything, I'll fight them. I took a karate class. I know 3 moves. The guests erupted in laughter, and even the officiant had to pause to compose himself. When it came time for Emily to present the rings, she carried the pillow as if it contained crown jewels, walking with exaggerated care before announcing to the assembled guests, "Just so you all know, I set them up. I'm basically a professional matchmaker. Now, if anyone needs help finding love, see me after the ceremony. My rates are very reasonable, Mrs. Helen, you're next on my list." Helen nearly choked on her champagne, and the guests dissolved into laughter again. The vows themselves were simple but profound. Jack promised to always stop for strangers in the rain, to keep fixing things with practical solutions and unwavering hope, to be the father Emily deserved and the husband Elizabeth had never expected to find. Elizabeth promised to fight for justice in all its forms, to use her magic hammer wisely, to embrace the beautiful chaos of loving a human tornado in an 8-year-old body, and to never take for granted the man who had shown her what true character looked like. As they exchanged rings, Emily whispered loudly to Helen, "This is the best thing I ever did. I'm really good at this matchmaking stuff." The ceremony concluded with a kiss that balanced dignified restraint with genuine emotion, prompting enthusiastic applause from guests and an exaggerated eye roll from Emily, who immediately declared herself starving and ready for reception food. During the reception, Emily took her self-appointed job as party coordinator very seriously. She taught Janet from the courthouse how to do popular dance moves, critiqued the DJ's song choices, more Disney songs, we need way more Disney, and ensured everyone knew the full story of her parents' relationship. So basically, Daddy fixed her car in the rain because he's nice. Then she used her magic hammer to save him from the bad guy because she's awesome. Then I drew a picture because I'm artistic. Then they fell in love because obviously they should. Then I told them to get married because I'm smart. And now we're a family. Any questions? One guest raised his hand, playing along with her presentation. "So you're saying you're responsible for all of this?" "Obviously. I mean, they helped a little bit, but mostly it was my excellent planning. I'm gifted that way." The adults within earshot laughed, but Emily's expression remained perfectly serious as she moved on to organize the next phase of reception activities. As Jack and Elizabeth shared their first dance, she leaned close to his ear, her voice carrying a hint of playful regret. "I broke so many ethical guidelines for you." He pulled her closer, his response equally quiet. "Was it worth it?" Elizabeth looked over at Emily, who was now attempting to teach the very serious Thomas Rivera how to do an elaborate dance move with absolutely zero success but maximum enthusiasm. Her gaze returned to Jack, the man who had stopped to help her on the worst night of an otherwise charmed professional life. Every single violation. Later, during what was supposed to be the father-daughter dance, Elizabeth joined them at Emily's insistent tugging, transforming the traditional moment into a family circle. Emily looked up at both of them with unusual seriousness, her perpetual motion temporarily stilled. "I'm really happy, like the happiest I've ever been in my whole entire life." "Me too, baby girl," Jack responded, his voice thick with emotion. "Me three," Elizabeth added, drawing them both closer. "Good, because now I have a mom who can teach me about the law and a dad who can teach me about fixing things, and I'll be basically unstoppable. I'm gonna run the world someday." "That's what I'm afraid of," Jack laughed. "Also, can we get a dog now? Because families should have dogs. It's basically a rule." I checked. "We'll talk about it," both parents responded in perfect unison. "That's parent talk 4, maybe." "Yes, I'm totally wearing you both down. I can feel it working." The evening concluded with sparklers lighting the garden path as Jack and Elizabeth departed for a weekend honeymoon, a brief getaway before returning to their newly combined household. Emily remained with Helen, already planning elaborate welcome home decorations and continuing her campaign for the family dog she felt certain was in her future. As they drove away from the venue, Elizabeth rested her head against Jack's shoulder, the formality of the day giving way to comfortable intimacy. "You know what I realized today?" Elizabeth's voice carried the relaxed quality that emerged only in their most private moments. "I spent my whole life thinking justice was about following rules, about maintaining the system. But sometimes the greatest justice comes from breaking rules that need breaking, from seeing the person beyond the case file, from trusting instinct over procedure. Jack covered her hand with his, the new ring still unfamiliar against his palm. And sometimes fixing things isn't about having the right tools or technical knowledge. It's about refusing to walk away when something's broken, even when fixing it seems impossible. He thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a chance encounter in the rain to a courtroom confrontation to this new beginning as a family. Each step had seemed impossible until it wasn't, each obstacle insurmountable until overcome. As if reading his thoughts, Elizabeth voiced the conclusion he'd been approaching. Sometimes the things that seem most unlikely are exactly what we need. The random connection, the impossible coincidence, the relationship that crosses boundaries we thought were fixed. Those are the things worth fighting for. Jack pulled the car over at a scenic overlook, the city lights spread below them like earthbound stars. They sat in comfortable silence, the day's emotions settling into peaceful certainty. Emily was right about one thing, Jack admitted finally. We definitely need a dog. Elizabeth's laughter filled the car, genuine and unrestrained. That child is going to be running international diplomacy before she's 30. And we'll be right there watching her change the world with the same determination she used to bring us together. The weekend honeymoon passed in a blur of quiet luxury. A boutique hotel, meals uninterrupted by Emily's boundless energy, conversations that meandered rather than being constantly redirected. They returned home to find the apartment transformed with streamers, hand-drawn signs, and Emily bouncing on the sofa in violation of house rules, her excitement too great to be contained by ordinary restrictions. On the refrigerator, a new drawing had been added to her collection, a family portrait showing Jack, Elizabeth, Emily, and a suspiciously large yellow dog standing beside a house much bigger than their apartment. I drew our future, Emily announced proudly. That's our new house with a yard for our dog. She's yellow because yellow is the best color, and her name is Justice because she's a law dog. The adults exchanged amused glances over Emily's head, both recognizing the losing battle when Emily set her mind to something. Elizabeth knelt to examine the drawing more carefully, pointing to a small structure in the backyard. And what's this? That's Daddy's workshop where he fixes things for people. And that's your office where you write important judge about stuff. And that's my art studio, because I'm going to be a famous artist and also maybe the president. The drawing represented more than Emily's wishful thinking. It captured a vision of their combined future, one where each person's individual strengths created something stronger together. Jack looked at his new wife and his daughter, both studying the refrigerator artwork with identical expressions of concentration, and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it manifested physically. From the darkest moment of his life had come this unexpected light. This family formed not through conventional paths, but through a series of choices to help, to believe, to persist when easier options were available. One broken down car, one impossible choice, a single father drowning in accusations he couldn't fight, a judge bound by rules that sometimes hindered the very justice they were designed to protect. And between them, a child whose simple logic cut through complications with the clearest vision of all. They had begun as strangers connected by random circumstance and become something none of them had anticipated. Proof that sometimes kindness comes back in ways no one can predict, that integrity matters even when rewards aren't guaranteed, that family can be built through choice rather than obligation. As Emily continued explaining her elaborate vision for their future home, Jack's hand found Elizabeth's, their fingers intertwining with comfortable familiarity. The journey ahead would bring new challenges, blending their lives, balancing careers and family, navigating the inevitable complications that arose when different worlds merged. But standing in their small kitchen, watching Emily's animated expressions as she detailed her plans for Justice the Law Dog's training regimen, Jack felt a certainty that transcended logical assessment. Whatever came next, they would face it together, with the same courage and integrity that had brought them to this unexpected happiness. Sometimes the greatest judgment you can make is choosing to follow your heart, even when it means bending rules that were written without room for mercy or human connection. Sometimes the bravest repair work involves your own life rather than broken objects. And sometimes the most important case isn't the one in the courtroom, but the one for your own happiness. A verdict only you can deliver.